Welcome everyone to day 2 of the 2023 Humanitarian Leadership Conference. My name is Josh Horan. I'm the Acting Director of the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership and the conference convener. Thanks to all who engaged with the conference yesterday. And today we're going to kick off with a very insightful and interesting keynote by a colleague who I'll introduce shortly. And then we can get into the main sessions following that, beginning at 3:45 Melbourne time or UCT +10. Before we do though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which I am, which is the Wurundjeri people, one of the 5 members of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to ancestors and elders past and present, acknowledging that the land on which we are is unceded land, and pay my respects. So thanks to everybody for dialing in yesterday and joining the various different sessions throughout the first day of the conference. We had over 560 views of the various different sessions. It seems like there was some amazing conversations and some really robust discussion. So thank you again for contributing. Your thoughts, your ideas, your perspectives, what you've seen working, and what could be improved. Certainly encourage you all to take a similar approach to today's sessions, and very much looking forward to engaging with you all in the sessions over the next 7 hours or so. Please don't forget to, as you're engaging in the conference on the platform, on social media, for example, please use the hashtag 2023 HLC or hashtag reengineering the system. And also don't forget to engage with colleagues in the platform itself. There's functions that you can access to keep the conversation going outside of the sessions, to reach out to people across the world that are participating in the conference. It's over 350 of us participating in the conference from around 80 different countries to date. So please do reach out if you see anybody saying something interesting or putting forward some interesting conversations, interesting examples. Also on the platform, on the CVent platform, you've got access to the exhibitor page, where you'll see some interesting images and short footage, and also to visit the sponsor page. So that we've got 3 virtual journals supporting the conference, the generous support from the Australian Government's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and from the global leadership recruitment company, Oxford HR. So we move into the second day. To begin the conversation, we have a fascinating discussion and keynote presentation from Ms. Adelina Kamal. Adelina joins us here in Melbourne and will be here for tomorrow's in-person workshops. And so very much looking forward to hearing Adelina's perspective and insights. Adelina worked for the ASEAN Secretariat for 22 years before becoming the 2nd Executive Director of the ASEAN AHA Centre that some of you are familiar with. Since leaving the AHA Centre in August 21, Adelina has been providing her insights, her perspectives, her analysis into some fascinating issues, both here in the region in Asia, Southeast Asia and the Pacific, but globally as well. And so very much welcome Adelina to the conference. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts over the next little while, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your keynote. Over to you, Adelina.
Thank you very much, Josh, for inviting me and also for kindly introducing me as one of your keynote speakers for this conference. Delighted to be here, delighted to be reconnected with many humanitarians at this place, CHL, as well as during the conference. As I was preparing for the conference about 2 weeks ago, the Myanmar military performed brutal airstrikes that killed close to 170 civilians. 40 of them were children, and the youngest victim was a 6-month-old baby. It was the deadliest airstrike since the February 2021 coup attempt. As the Myanmar crisis is unfolding and escalating before us, and it is close to home and to this part of the region, I will use the Myanmar crisis as a case in point. But I should first mention that whatever I'm going to present today is my personal view. As an independent analyst, it doesn't reflect the view of the organizations that I work for in the past or the institution that I was affiliated with. I'm going to use slides not to show the summary of my points, so do not look for bullet points in my slides, but rather as a transition, because I divide my presentation into segments. So after each slide, I would like to request the technician to kindly zoom back on me. So the first slide to begin with, and I'll talk about the unpopular model called humanitarian resistance. You may have heard or read about this being quoted by one of the humanitarian policy influencer, Professor Hugo Slim, that being humanitarian is universal, but it is not uniform. There is indeed a variety of approaches or models of humanitarianism. The reality of the humanitarian system, while it remains to be dominated by large international agency, predominantly headquartered in the so-called global north, it is not monolithic. But while it may be diverse, it is not necessarily mutually reinforcing, but rather competing with each other. Let's have a closer look on what's happening in Myanmar. Following the military coup d'etat on the 1st of February 2021, when the military illegally seized power just before the newly elected parliament was due to convene for the first time, we witnessed Myanmar turning into a slaughterhouse. The junta has killed thousands, detained at least 17,000, and massacred, tortured, inflicted violence on people nationwide. Villages have been reduced to ashes by military arson attacks as well as airstrikes. Myanmar ranks among the countries with the most intense levels of violence and conflict death last year, next to Ukraine. And so far in 2023, Myanmar has the highest number of civilian casualties by airstrike in the world. The United Nations has estimated that 17.6 million people, or nearly 1/3 of the population, are in need of humanitarian assistance this year. At least 1.5 million people are internally displaced, with thousands more seeking refuge across the borders in neighboring Thailand and India each day. And we have more than 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. The military brutality has ignited nationwide resistance movement and brought the majority of the people and an array of ethnic minorities, including the Rohingya, to stand more united than before against the military dictatorship. But after leaving the Aha Center a few months after the coup, I had the privilege and the opportunity to observe up close and personal how Myanmar's grassroots aid, the frontline local humanitarian responders, deliver assistance to the crisis-affected people. There I witnessed resilience at its best. is a forced resilience, a means of survival built over decades of resistance and strengthened after the February 2021 coup. It's the purest form of courage, ingenuity, and solidarity. Who are they? Many of them are refugees themselves or have been running and hiding from the military atrocities for months, years, and even decades. These local groups operate in ethnic areas along the borders that are not controlled by the military junta. While most of them operate along the borders, they can organize assistance deep into the country through informal networks. They don't come along with big trucks crossing the border. They don't wear uniform or vest, colorful vest. They won't declare who and where they are unless they trust you. They are invisible. It's another model of humanitarianism called humanitarian resistance, coined by Professor Hugo Slim a few months after the coup. Now, the next slide. Falling on deaf ears. In my subsequent quest to help these frontline local humanitarian actors, I came across similar models of humanitarian resistance in other parts of the world, such as in Ukraine and Syria. I talked to these resistant actors from Syria and Ukraine. In all of these cases, I observe a common thread that humanitarian resistance is not sufficiently supported. It's often challenged and stigmatized. Their resilience then propelled me to write more about it and to advocate for this model of humanitarian resistance to be better recognized and supported. A recent study by the Humanitarian Outcomes just came out last week, I think, looking at the coverage, the operational reach, and the effectiveness of humanitarian aid in Myanmar. It concludes that local actors are responsible for most assistance provided as compared to formal aid system. The study indicates that the operational presence and reach of the formal aid sector in Myanmar is limited and is not poised to improve. And therefore, it makes little sense to focus all of the planning and resource mobilization efforts on the formal aid response. The study further suggests that the localized and the informal aid, those are, provided by the volunteers and the local actors, and much of it driven by the cross-border entities, is reaching much more significant numbers of people and has room to further scale up. I would suggest that you look at this study report by the Humanitarian Outcomes. And I will be interested to see the reaction from donors and international agencies on these important findings. Perhaps they will listen more. Because most of the reaction that I've got so far during my advocacy has been either skepticism, that the locally led approach in Myanmar will not work. So let's just stick to the status quo, decide what's in it for us. Or indifference. They don't even care. Some were positive, though, that this could be the way to go, but few have turned their optimism into action. Humanitarians are supposed to try as much as possible to save lives and reduce the suffering and of the affected people, whoever they are, based on their needs, wherever needs are found. It's the job of humanitarians to ensure that assistance is effectively reaching those in direst need. Progress should be measured by how well assistance is able to reach the most affected in the deepest, hardest hit, hard to assess areas. In the case of Myanmar, we have the sufficient evidence, such as those coming from the Humanitarian Outcomes and my own study published by the ODI Humanitarian Practice Network. we have the evidence that there are more effective humanitarian agents out there who are able to have deeper and wider operational coverage and are trusted by the people affected by the crisis. So why are we not trusting them? It's a double jeopardy for these local actors. Not only are they the survivors themselves, they're often labeled as rebels, backpackers, inexperienced humanitarians, poor administrators. Donors and external actors are nervous whether or not to support them. I talked to one humanitarian policy influencer out of my frustration. Why is this model of humanitarianism not supported? Humanitarian resistance is technically feasible and morally imperative based on my study. But why are we falling on deaf ears? He gave me a simple answer. Well, Adelina, the system that we have today has been leaning more towards governments and the formal aid structures and systems with formal mandates. This is the system that most people know and are most comfortable with. Some donors told me that it's not about whether these local actors are perceived less effective. The donors are just used to the bigger and the formal aid system, the so-called humanitarian giants, the Ivy League of humanitarian institutions. Another person, my mentor, told me, well, Adelina, most people are the big fans of group thinking approach. The contrarian approach in the system is perceived as a threat and not well rewarded. Next slide, please. Doing more with less. Myanmar crisis is among the world's most neglected humanitarian crises. While Myanmar and Ukraine share equal numbers of people in need, the disparity in aid resources between the two countries is stark. The UN Humanitarian Response Plan for Ukraine is 5 times higher. Last year, only 35% of the response plan for Myanmar was funded, compared to 79% for Ukraine. Even for Myanmar, it's more grim this year because the UN is targeting significantly fewer people for aid this year, 4.5 million people with severe needs compared to 6.2 million last year. Within first quarter this year, only 8% of the $764 million of what is being requested under the response plan has been funded. But as often pointed out by local groups who have been delivering aid since the coup, the figure is an underestimate. It does not cover people on the move who are fleeing and hiding from the junta deep in the forest. It doesn't cover children on the move in hiding who are taken care of by these local groups while their parents are fighting against the military force. So when we are faced with this scarcity of financial resource, when those raising funds for Myanmar must compete with other equally pressing and in some cases more politically visible crises, it makes more sense to me to find how to do more with less. Not only that the resources are scarce, but some are frozen inside the country by the junta. So rather than letting the resource inside a fridge and doing very little inside the country, because you're only trying to get access from the junta, is it not more realistic to divert these resources and put the money and the efforts somewhere else? In the long run, supporting humanitarian resistance will empower the crisis-affected people and build resilience for sustainable peace. As a note, though, I'm not advocating for less for Ukraine, but if the world can raise that much solidarity for Ukraine, we should do better for the so many forgotten and neglected crises in other parts of the world. Next slide, please. It's a muddy ecosystem. The Myanmar crisis is complicated and muddy, worsened by the February 2021 coup and exacerbated by the geopolitical interests of external political actors, making aid provision loaded with political interest. Then you have this heavily bureaucratized formal humanitarian system coming into the equation, muddying the already complex ecosystem. But when the elephants fight, the grass suffers. The grass won't be able to even fathom the complexity because they are too busy hiding and surviving. So for the sake of the grass, those in the direst need who are currently still hiding and being treated after the brutal airstrikes that hit their villages, isn't it our job, the external humanitarians, to reduce the complexity and seek for simplicity by creating not a muddy environment, but a conducive environment and supporting those who can deliver it more directly and more effectively? Isn't that also humanitarian action? Next, please. Humanitarian aid or political propaganda? As you already know, humanitarian action is increasingly becoming the only political leverage in many crises, including in Myanmar. But when humanitarian aid is used as a substitute in the absence of a political inaction, and when we, the humanitarians, allow this to happen, what will be achieved is political propaganda, not humanitarian objectives of saving lives, reducing the suffering of the affected people, and ensuring their dignity. Humanitarians and humanitarian system have the choice to either let this continue or to transform the system by stepping back and supporting those who can do the job better. Isn't that called leadership? Knowing when to step back and support from behind. Next slide. From ecosystem to ecosystem. The dominant humanitarian system that we have now is a highly bureaucratized system with complex standards created by those with superiority for those with superiority. Only those with financial strengths can maintain such superiority. Based on my experience, those coming from such a superior system often comes with superiority complex. I experienced it during the cyclone Nargis in Myanmar in 2008, when I was helping the Secretary General of ASEAN setting up and operationalizing the ASEAN-led ASEAN First Humanitarian Operation on the ground. It was 2008. It was a different regime. There's a joke back then that it was far more challenging to deal with the expatriates from the Big Eight than to deal with the then regime. I continued to witness superiority complex when ASEAN set up a new kid on the block called the AHA Center 12 years ago in 2011. And even years later, when the AHA Center supporting Indonesia, the Philippines, and other ASEAN countries going through catastrophic natural hazard-induced disasters. After I left the ASEAN system in August 2021, I continued observing such a superiority complex, more so in the case of Myanmar crisis, from the lens of the local humanitarian responders. I should say, however, that there are individuals from the dominant humanitarian system that do not suffer from this security complex. The expatriate humanitarian heroes coming to the crisis-affected country with their response cavalry claiming to offer money, superior technology and expertise better than what is available in the country are not always white. There are also those who look like me. After I left the system, apart from advocating for more support for humanitarian resistance, I also got into this reimagining the humanitarian architecture. How to change the humanitarian ecosystem into a humanitarian ecosystem that is more diverse, inclusive, and collaborative. I argued that changing the status quo is rarely an internal driven process. It's always the disruptive forces from the outside that challenge the status quo. It's like the rebellion versus the empire. Because realistically, not everybody within the dominant humanitarian system will be comfortable about changing the status quo, as there are no benefits or incentives from within the system to do it. Someone said to me, and he is the king of exaggeration, well, Adelina, people are not comfortable committing suicide and making themselves irrelevant. So don't expect them to change the system from within. That's why I have little expectation on the Green Bargain, sorry to say, and the flagship initiative, which attempt to transform the humanitarian system, as long as these projects are still driven from those inside the system. For sure, we cannot expect Elon Musk or the lookalike to shake the system and challenge the status quo and create the so-called humanitarian equilibrium or demolish the aid system. That would be unrealistic. The current bureaucracy is too big and too deep-rooted that it is too hard to dismantle and too slow to change. And there is no competitor that is powerful enough to change the status quo and challenge this obsolete old tradition of humanitarianism. So now going back into the crisis in Myanmar, what can we learn from the Myanmar crisis to reinvigorate change? I think it's too much to expect that the local actors become the solo agents for change. In a conflict, complex, and fragile setting like what's happening in Myanmar, these local actors should be in the lead roles, yes, but there needs to be some catalysts, facilitators, supporters. And it is best that these are not coming from inside the system that will benefit from the status quo. The job of these catalysts or facilitators, who are essentially external humanitarians to the country affected by the crisis, is to facilitate the creation of networks to connect the local actors in Myanmar with local actors in other countries. And these external actors should also share the same motivation as the local actors. Going back to this networks of local humanitarian actors at the front, supported by external humanitarians, I will also call them the backroom aides. And I wish, these networks already existed when I was trying to figure out, how should I call this emerging model coming out of the Myanmar crisis? Because I was trying to find, what actually work and how to, make it more interesting for the donors to support. But only later that I found, some similar models. So I think, they are scattered, this so-called external humanitarian facilitators or the catalysts. They're not necessarily connected and reinforcing to one another. These external humanitarians, I will also call them the backroom aides. Some of these actually have existed, I realize. So these are things like the START network, the ground truth solutions. I'm hoping to meet with them. here at the conference, the humanitarian outcomes, the report that just came out, the new humanitarian, the Humanitarian Practice Network of the ODI, the True Humanitarian podcast. So we can build on this, but they need to be more interconnected and reinforcing one another so that they can help, the local actors and actually get them further strengthened. Now, for this fragile setting, who could be the backroom aides? One would be a group of humanitarian researchers and thinking practitioners to help gather evidence that support locally led action, develop new norms to determine which of the international standards are fundamental and which ones are ornamental. Another group will be the humanitarian media who write influential narratives about the underreported stories of disaster and neglected humanitarian crisis, to bring stories from the ground on the resilience of these people and to balance the narratives from the old traditional humanitarianism. Another group could be the humanitarian techs, who will help simplify and shorten the aid chain using technology to cut layers and remove intermediaries, make the aid flows as direct and more efficient and more customized as possible, while ensuring that the people are not left behind. And another group could be humanitarian donors, non-traditional humanitarian donors that are not driven by the political motivation, such as the diaspora groups for Myanmar, or creating an innovative financing, shall we? Getting the public to donate $8 per month to contribute to the underfunded, neglected crisis rather than paying for blue check mark for the Twitter. So this is the last slide. A new level of resilience. Next slide, please. I differentiated how the ecosystem can be nurtured in a fragile setting like in Myanmar, and how the ecosystem can be nurtured in a context when the governments are functioning and able and willing to help their own people. There should be a difference. Because in the first setting, I remove intentionally the role of the de facto authority, in the case of Myanmar is the military junta, from the equation, because we cannot and we should not expect them to have a goodwill to help the people that they're trying to annihilate in the first place. But in the context where the governments are able and willing and not killing and terrorizing their own people, the local and national actors, including the governments at the national and local level, should band themselves together and become allies to create the so-called level playing field from within, and to be more assertive on their roles and contribution to the affected population that they are trying to serve. It's a similar model of ecosystem offered by Tem Raiskan yesterday. In fact, I wrote about this in October 2021 after I left the Art Center, and the paper was published by an Australian-Indonesian program called Siap Siaga. And my paper is called Creating a Level Playing Field, Lessons from COVID-19 on Improving Localization. It focuses more on creating an ecosystem within a natural hazard-induced disaster where the government is able and willing to help their own people. I argued in that paper, in a situation when the government is able and willing, actors inside the country should not wait for a change from the international system to happen. So rather than tinkering, for the international system to change, the national and local actors should liberate themselves and, create allies among themselves and work together from within, work with the government to create an enabling environment for local and national actors to thrive and grow, support multi-stakeholder national policy to clarify the roles and responsibility of the different stakeholders in the country, build local and national knowledge and expertise, build resilience, not reliance, strengthen the governance, the system, and the standards that are more contextualized to the country, but comparable to the international standards. So we're trying to do this in many of the ASEAN countries. I could see many governments are trying to do that in many of the ASEAN countries. But essentially, the elements within this ecosystem, when the government is able and willing to have their own people, will have to be reinforcing one another. It's just like the nature, you know, one cannot be stronger than another. There should not be major forces trying to manage the whole ecosystem like what we have right now, the ecosystem, so that there will be a check balance in the healthy ecosystem, as each element is mutually dependent, but they are collaborating and evolving. And we should definitely get regional organization like ASEAN, the Pacific Islands, the African Union, the Caribbeans, to support this alliance. It's not such a new concept because, for example, in Indonesia, there's also this concept of sustainable resilience, which is much more advanced than just a resilience, but basically trying not to firefight from one disaster to another in view of the climate change and the poly-crisis. In all of these models, and this is my last few sentences, Josh, I found some common fundamental features. On the part of the disaster or crisis-affected population, it's called self-determination. Being an active participant, not only recipient. It's not nice, you know, to be receiving aid all the time. So they should not only be the one benefiting, but also contributing by becoming an active actor. On the part of those facilitating and supporting the external humanitarians, the other common fundamental features that should exist are a deep sense of humility and respect for local knowledge, partnership, and equity. I would love to work with those of you who are interested to challenge the ecosystem that we have today constructively from the outside and nurture an ecosystem that respects self-determination and put humility at the core of humanitarian action. Thank you. I provide as the last slide links to my recent articles that are relevant to this presentation, as well as my contact details. Thank you again for listening. And I think we have 7 more minutes for question and answer, Josh. Is that right? Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Adelina. That was wonderful. It's got goosebumps tingling. I think there's so much in there that we can take forward and with humility work with you, work with Tamrise and anybody else that's interested in this conference to work on some of these provocations, these proposals, to shift things in a pragmatic, practical way. Please do get in touch during the conference and afterwards at events at cfhl.org.au, and we'll be curating some of that in the weeks and months to come, hopefully. So thanks once again, Adelina. It's incredibly insightful and incredibly inspiring, and a reflection on the nature of the formal system versus what's really happening out there around the world. Any questions coming to the fore? Send them through, and I'll ask Deacon Events to help me with that. But as we're waiting, I just wanted to reflect on some of the things you mentioned, Adelina, and just to encourage colleagues that have dialed in and are watching this, or that engaged yesterday and today in the conference, to think through some of these provocations that both Adelina and Tamrise have put forward around the incentive structure, the motivations, what needs to shift, what is already shifted on some of those fronts. Adelina mentioned the mandates, and both Tamrise and Adelina mentioned models, like different ways different models of assistance that are already happening in Myanmar, that are happening in different ways in Pakistan, for example. That's incredibly deep and difficult to deal with, but to get through those models, those different ways of models, the mandates, and obviously the money we've heard about. We have a question from Daniel Delati. Thank you for Adelina. When you talk about having all non-traditional humanitarian actors coming together, what are the most important or strategic actions should take place in the next few years?
I think it is important that we have this so-called good practice collected, as well as evidence collected, to start changing the narratives. There was this study by the ODI, Humanitarian Policy Group, which is quite interesting, that we don't necessarily need only facts and figures. In fact, what we need is narratives, and more narratives, but with evidence based. It's quite hard though, because I've been using that, right, and still falling on deaf ears. But I think if many of us are doing that and trying to analyze, right, from an independent point of view, and then try to connect the good practices or the challenges from one crisis to another, and then present this, right, collectively as a network. I think we will be able to slowly and steadily challenge the ecosystem. I personally already give up changing, inside the system, but because we have been doing that, right? And I perhaps also because of the history that I have in terms of colonization. We fought for our independence, being Indonesians and all that. I always believe that you will be able to be at the stage, right, that you want in terms of equity and justice and whatever it is, if you fight for it. And there is no, we have seen it: rebellion versus the empire, Uber versus the Bluebird taxi, right, and so many others. The thing that actually is coming outside the system, actually challenging the system inside even better. But I think evidence-based research and narratives will be important, and then and for us, these groups of humanitarian facilitators or BNA to get connected to one another. I mentioned earlier that it's so difficult for me to find whether this is acceptable, right? Because humanitarian resistance is seen as dropping one of the very important principle of humanitarian principles, that is neutrality. And often we trap in a debate, right? Whether it is okay to drop that kind of neutrality. But I think we need to be brave, right? Brave enough that it is not only just one model, there are also others. And not necessarily always coming from the so-called global north or the west, because it's not the privilege of everyone. Only those coming from international have the privilege of being neutral. And that even being questioned right now. So having the empirical evidence, but also coupled with narratives, and then getting these networks together, I think would be the first strategic step. I would want to have, someone that can create the platform for us to get connected, but also being very careful not to steer too much, because after all, these local networks will have to be the one at the front. So we really have to figure out the formula to do that.
Thanks, Adelina, and thanks, Daniel, for the question. There's a couple more questions coming through, but unfortunately we're at time. So please do continue the conversation through this event platform. There's discussion fora in there. Reach out to us via email. Use the social media platforms of your choosing with the hashtags 2023 HLC or re-engineering the system. For those that are able to come tomorrow in person in Melbourne, for everybody else, I look forward to engaging with you online over the next 6 and a bit hours. Thanks once again, Adelina, and thank you to you all.